All right. So yesterday in here, we hopefully kind of wrapped up our look at some of these inherently destabilizing factors that we have always kind of historically seen in Afghanistan, most notably the cultural code of Pashtunwali. And that then kind of brings a question to mind that many students have asked me over the years, and that is, well, if Afghanistan is a country that has this kind of myriad of inherent problems, why is it even a country that exists on the map today? And kind of the long and short answer of that is the same answer that I oftentimes give to many countries, whether it's in Africa or in Asia, and that is that basically the modern day boundaries of Afghanistan were not inherently created by the people that live there, but rather as a result of external factors and external politics, most notably the whims of foreign powers in the age of imperialism. So specifically where we kind of see Afghanistan pop up in its modern sense is during the 19th century. You had the British Empire down in India, you had the Russian Empire up in Central Asia, and so pretty much Afghanistan was meant to be this kind of like mountainous no man's land. It was meant to be an inherently ungovernable place that was meant to serve as like a buffer state between the other two, to try to prevent, conflict between the British and the Russians on a shared border. So pretty much from the beginning, Afghanistan didn't have much in the way of national unity, or much in the way of centralized government. You would kind of have on and again, off again kings that would oftentimes kind of rise up and become king, in part because they had the support of various tribes or various clans, but that typically they didn't last long, and then they'd be overthrown and replaced by somebody else. Well, really the exception to that rule, and really I would say kind of the only time in Afghanistan's like modern history that you truly did have a significant level of peace and stability, was from 1933 to 1973, during the reign of a man by the name of Zahir Shah. And Zahir Shah, his whole take on things and his whole take on ruling the country of Afghanistan was very much kind of like a live and let live approach. He was somebody that was a modernizer. He understood how far behind his country was behind the rest of the world. He was somebody that wanted to court outside businesses and try to bring in, foreign dollars to kind of fix his country up. He wanted to, educate his population. He wanted to bring his country kind of into the rest of the world's kind of orbit, and commercial sphere. But he also understood that large-scale reforms would not go down overly well with some of these kind of rural Pashtun tribesmen that we had talked about in yesterday's lesson. People that lived in remote, mountainous, valley villages that had remained pretty much untouched and unchanged for thousands and thousands of years. So when I say that Zahir Shah, had this live and let live approach, pretty much his approach to governance of his country was, hey, I'm going to fix up the cities. I'm going to bring in reforms and changes and, businesses to the cities, but I'm not going to touch the rural countryside. If you guys want to live the same way that you've been living for thousands of years, knock yourself out. I'm not going to bother you, but you don't bother me. And for the most part, this live and let live approach worked very, very well. I always find it so shocking. I think many people find it shocking when you look at pictures of Afghanistan from Zahir Shah's reign. These pictures are all from like the 1960s. And it looks like a completely different world than the Afghanistan that we know currently. So you see these two women, in a Western style record store. You have a group of Afghan, female students, probably either high school or college age students. And if I wouldn't have told you that, hey, these girls are in Afghanistan, my guess is that you probably have no idea, and just assume that, hey, these are like, hippies in the United States. Same styles, same kind of level of a gender equality that we see, in places like Kabul during this period. We see the family portrait and Western style architecture, a university classroom. In fact, Afghanistan during this period of time increasingly became a major tourist hub. In addition to Western businesses flowing in, for example, Ford Motor Company built a big factory producing trucks outside of Kabul for sale in the East Asian market. But in addition to that, thousands upon thousands of American tourists would voluntarily travel to Afghanistan every year to take in the sights, to travel around the country, because again, it was safe. It was naturally very beautiful. It was viewed as kind of like, the next big up and coming place. So I put here a side-by-side picture of two tourists in a park in Kabul. And then this is what the same park in Kabul looks like today. So again, that's what 40 or 50 years of nonstop warfare will pretty much do to a place. Here's another side-by-side photo. So this one shows a postcard of kind of a central marketplace area. And then you see the same region in the background today, which, albeit not horrendous, but you also do see, the homelessness, you see kind of the neglect, you see the garbage everywhere. So definitely not what it once was. Here's another postcard of Kabul during this region. So you see the whitewashed architecture and the parks and the beautiful, canal through the center of the city and the mountains in the background. I mean, people literally referred to Kabul, Afghanistan as the Paris of the East. And during the 1960s in particular, there was actually something called the Hippie Trail, where American hippies would fly into Kabul and then they would backpack through rural Afghanistan over the mountains into Pakistan. So basically some of the most dangerous places on earth today to travel through, the kind of places you go to, you're probably going to get abducted and have your head chopped off on camera and appear on the internet. And then they would hike all the way down to India and then fly back home out of Goa, India. So again, this was something that thousands of people did because it was safe and it was a very hospitable environment. So the question then, is, well, what the heck happened? What went awry? Well, what went awry was basically you have a series of like revolution / government overthrow / after government overthrow, you have multiple of these in like a 5-year time span. And it all starts in 1973, where Zahir Shah goes out of the country. He travels out of the country for a routine cataracts eye surgery. So he wanted foreign medical assistance. He leaves, and while he's out of the country, one of his main advisors, a man by the name of Daoud, stages a coup and seizes power. Now, Daoud, in his own right, was woefully unpopular. He ruled with an iron fist, whereas Zahir Shah was much more of a kind of benevolent, respected monarch. And so Daoud alienated much of the population almost overnight, which then kind of radicalized them and then gave rise in 1978 to the Afghan Communist Party. And the Afghan Communist Party then stages a coup or a government overthrow of its own in 1978 and becomes the de facto government of Afghanistan. Now, whereas Zahir Shah, and some of these previous leaders had taken this live and let live approach to the rural countryside, the Afghan Communist Party took the exact polar opposite approach. They wanted to create a utopian communist wonderland in Afghanistan overnight. So they, from day one, enacted policies like land reform. That, hey, we're going to go into these rural areas and we're going to seize the land from the individual farmers and we are going to equally redistribute it. Well, again, you think about that from the perspective of Pashtunwali, where people are loyal to their clan and to their tribe and to their village, and that people feel the need to revenge any kind of wrongs done upon them. Well, if somebody from the government's coming in and seizing this land that's maybe been in your family for hundreds, if not thousands of years, you're probably not just going to sit down and take that. Some other things that they also instituted was policies promoting, equality of the genders. If we're all equal in a communist state, that means women as well as men. So, of course, that didn't go over with the conservative, burqa-wearing families in rural Afghanistan. And then thirdly, and most notably, in the Communist Manifesto, it states that religion is the opiate of the masses. That it is something that detracts from loyalty to the state, and that kind of waters down the pain of your existence and distracts you from how bad your life is. So according to Karl Marx, the writer of the Communist Manifesto, in a true communist state, religion should be abolished. There should be no formal religion whatsoever. Well, this Afghan communist government decrees that, hey, there's no public worship allowed, all the mosques have to be closed, and that is the final straw in a super religiously conservative nation, and you get literally kind of mass uprisings and revolts throughout the rural countryside. And these revolts are so prevalent that it literally looks like by early 1979 that this newly established communist government is going to be overthrown. Well, these rebels, the name that they end up taking, and be aware, this was not a unified fighting force. It wasn't an us versus them. It was kind of small pockets of localized resistance that popped up all over the place. These people referred to themselves as the Mujahideen. And Mujahideen is an Arabic word that if you translate it into English, it literally means holy warriors. So these were people that thought that first and foremost that they were fighting for their religion, that they were fighting for their faith, that they were being involved in a jihad or religious struggle against these, atheists. Okay. Well, in the context of fighting then against this growing insurgency by the Mujahideen, in 1979, the Soviet Union then invades Afghanistan. And they invade Afghanistan basically to prop up and to keep in power this teetering communist regime. Well, it's in this context then of this new then Soviet-Afghan war that breaks out. That's going to last for a whopping 10 years, all the way until 1989, that we see enter stage left Mr. Osama bin Laden. And I put up here just, a little bit of kind of background about Osama bin Laden. So Osama bin Laden was not from Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was from Saudi Arabia. And in fact, his dad was actually one of the wealthiest men in Saudi Arabia. His dad had owned a construction company. His dad had become really good friends with the king of Saudi Arabia. And so when the king of Saudi Arabia starts to hand out, construction contracts to businesses to build stuff within his country, who gets most of those lucrative jobs? It's the bin Laden construction company. It's Osama's father. So the entire highway system in Saudi Arabia, basically built by the bin Ladens. Much of the airport originally built by the bin Ladens. Have you ever seen the Kaaba before in Mecca, that big black box that Muslims will circle 7 times during the Hajj celebrations? That whole massive mosque facility built by the bin Laden family as well. So Osama was pretty much a spoiled rich kid. It's estimated that his cut of his dad's inheritance when his dad died was somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million. Now, Osama, when he goes off to college, like many people that go off to college, he ends up kind of being exposed to new ideas and comes under the influence of some professors and preachers and whatnot. And that's when Osama kind of goes down this kind of radical religious path. Prior to this, in his youth, he was just a spoiled rich kid kind of brat. Later on in his college days is where he becomes this kind of religious zealot. And specifically, it's during that time that the Afghan-Soviet war breaks out. And he says, you know what? I got this money. I got these resources. I'm a devoted Muslim. All devoted Muslims should take part in this jihad or this religious struggle against these infidel invaders. And so I'm going to use my money to help out. And in order to help out, what he ends up founding is an organization that he calls Al Qaeda. Now, Al Qaeda is an Arabic term that if you literally translate it into English, literally means the base. That's it. Nothing sinister, no boogeyman in the closet here. The base. And that begs the question then of the base of what? Well, the base of logistics for foreign fighters, for other young Arabs from the Middle East like himself that wanted to travel to Afghanistan and take part in that religious jihad or holy war. So what Osama does, during the bulk of the 1980s is that he's hanging out over here in the border regions of Pakistan, and he's paying for thousands of young, Arab men's, plane tickets to fly over to Pakistan, where he then trains them, he outfits them, he gives them all the supplies and weaponry that they need, and then he sneaks them over the border into Afghanistan to fight side by side with the Mujahideen. So, this influx of Al Qaeda foreign fighters is something that really helps apply additional pressure against the Soviets during this conflict. Now, the other, and what I would view larger factor, though, that also tips kind of the balance of the war, is that starting pretty much in 1980, early Ronald Reagan administration, our country also starts to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars in weapons and money and supplies to these various Mujahideen groups. Now, something that oftentimes gets kind of misconstrued or misrepresented is that I think a lot of sources and a lot of people think that like this means that, like the CIA was over there handing out guns to all of these jihadists, and we're handing out guns to, Al Qaeda, and we're like, giving briefcases of money to Osama bin Laden. Like, no, that is not what was happening. Instead, we indirectly funded many Mujahideen groups. And the way that we did this was that we would give money and supplies to the Pakistani government, because Pakistan was kind of a major ally of ours in the region at that time. The Pakistani government and their secret service, so their version of like the CIA, would then get in contact with various Mujahideen groups over in Afghanistan and would then funnel those supplies directly to them. Well, early on in the war, we were very kind of covert about our supplies. Like oftentimes what we would do is we would buy, foreign weapons. So we'd like buy French guns, or we'd buy, British-made guns, or we'd buy Chinese-made guns or whatever. And then we would take those like foreign guns and ship them over. Well, by about 1985, 1986, we start to be way more overt in our support. By that point, the Soviet Union is kind of teetering on the brink of collapse, and we view them as just needing kind of like a big shove. And so we start to directly send over American-made weaponry. And the most notable was something called a Stinger surface-to-air missile system. And the Stinger missile systems, these are your kind of shoulder-mounted RPGs, your heat-sinking missiles. And these were a game changer because the main way that the Soviets fought in this war was by using attack helicopter. They'd fly attack helicopter into these remote mountain valley regions, and they would find villages, where, Mujahideen fighters were hanging out, and they would just level the village and kill everybody. Well, all of a sudden, if you got a guy sitting there on the side of a mountain with one of these RPGs, you can knock that Soviet attack helicopter out of the sky. And in the last 3 years of the war, basically the kill percentage in terms of, number of these used versus number of attack helicopters knocked out of the sky, the kill percentage was something like 79%, which was absolutely off the chart. So this war ends up becoming a protracted war of attrition. Millions of Afghans die, especially millions of Afghan civilians die from these Soviet atrocities. But also, tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers die. And so really, in the minds of many people back in the Soviet Union, this Soviet-Afghan war becomes their version of Vietnam. It becomes this unwinnable war that's super costly in terms of money and loss of life. And so by 1989, they just say, heck with it, we're out of here. We can't win. We got to worry about ourselves. And 2 years later, then the Soviet Union collapses under severe economic duress. Now, the other thing I always point out, too, is that it's during this time then in Afghanistan and Pakistan that Osama and Al Qaeda really kind of formalize their core beliefs. And I put here just a quick summary of their core beliefs. So basically they felt that what the end-all be-all goal should be after the struggle against the Soviet Union was that true Muslims should band together to drive out, any non-Muslims from traditionally Muslim parts of the world. So North Africa, the Middle East, pretty much all the way over like India, places like Indonesia as well. And that once they do this, they should then create just like one massive religious-based country governed by religious law. And then with that, they also felt that, hey, any kind of, offshoot sects of Islam. So Shiite Muslims, Sufi Muslims, that those people are heretics and that they should likewise be wiped out. So this kind of sets the stage for later actions. And then this is just a picture of some Mujahideen fighters, and you notice the one guy carrying the Stinger missile system. Here's another picture of a Mujahideen fighter carrying a Stinger missile system. So this is definitely a game changer for sure. Now, whenever the war ends, in 1989, Osama originally goes back to Saudi Arabia, but he very quickly runs afoul of the Saudi royal family. And how he runs afoul of them is that he is overtly critical of their decision to host American soldiers during Operation Desert Storm, which starts in 1990. So that's when Saddam Hussein of Iraq invades Kuwait. It was the concern that Saddam would keep on rolling into Saudi Arabia and seize a bunch of Saudi oil wells. So in order to protect Saudi Arabia, we deploy something like 500,000 American troops. And Osama viewed this as like the ultimate sinful affront, the fact that there were, that many non-Muslim, infidels in the birthplace of Islam, on holy ground. And so he calls for a revolution. He calls for, assassination of the royal family and the whole 9 yards. And basically the Saudi king says to him, all right, I'm not going to kill you because, I was BFFs with your dad and we respect your family. However, you're no longer welcome here. We're revoking your citizenship. We're sending you into permanent exile. Get the heck out. So Osama gets kicked out. He kind of wanders around for a little bit looking for a home, and he ends up finding safe haven first in the country of Sudan, located kind of in northeastern Africa. Now, it's during his time in Sudan then that Osama and his kind of core group of Al Qaeda leadership start carrying out their first attacks against the United States and against American forces abroad. So the most notable first attack was the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. And of course, if you know nothing about this, the plan was that they had this big truck bomb and they had parked it in an underground parking garage below the one tower, and they had parked it right near this main support beam. And their plan was that with the blast, it would hopefully knock out the support beam. It would cause the tower to fall. And they were hoping that the collapse of the first tower would then crash into the second tower, causing that one to fall as well. Now, obviously, that didn't go exactly according to plan, though it did cause significant destruction and death. And it really kind of put Al Qaeda on our nation's radar as a major concern moving forward. Now, at the same time that that's happening back in Afghanistan, Soviet Union withdraws, they lose the war, they leave, and it creates this massive power vacuum in Afghanistan. All of a sudden, the communist government there collapses, there's no central authority, and what you then have almost immediately is all of these different Mujahideen groups, because there's dozens and dozens of different groups of Mujahideen fighters during the war. Well, they all then turn on one another. They all have very different views of what Afghanistan should look like moving forward. And so you get this horrific multi-sided civil war, which lasts all the way until 1996, in which hundreds of thousands of more people die. Millions then flee into refugee camps, and you get a humanitarian disaster, right on the coattails of a previous humanitarian disaster. Well, it's into that context that we see in the Civil War emerge really the most powerful, influential of these Mujahideen factions. And that is the group that becomes known as the Taliban. And I put there, the Taliban, literally, if you translate that into English, it means students. So these were, young, super devout religious radicals. I mean, these were your most extremist-minded people, that basically believe that, hey, we should live our lives and our country should be governed word for word according to the Muslim Quran. If it's in there, we should do it. If it's not in there, we shouldn't do it. And with that, a big part of what they wanted to do was to pretty much turn back the clock and to run Afghan society, the way that, Muslim society was ran during what they perceived as the golden age of 1,000 years ago. So, women all covered, nobody, no females receiving any kind of education, complete, cutting off from the outside world, no external trade. They wanted to bring about an extremely isolated, religious-based society. Well, you might wonder, well, how the heck is a group with that kind of message going to end up, taking all of Afghanistan. Well, again, they were the most fanatical, so they wouldn't surrender. They would fight to the last man kind of thing, which, has its pros and cons, but on the battlefield can carry the day. But secondly, one of the things that they did bring pretty much everywhere that they went, anywhere that they took territory, is they brought about almost immediately significant law and order, to a population that had not known law and order for over 2 decades. So when they would go into an area, they'd set up courts right away. They'd set up basically police, and they would adjudicate. And they would say, all right, who has done wrongs to other people over the past 20 years? Who's stolen from you? Who's committed adultery? Who has murdered somebody else? And they would bring those people forward and they would try them and they would dispense justice very publicly and very rapidly. So this picture over here, I always point out, is a really famous one. So this is after they took the city of Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, and they made much of the city's population pile then into the local soccer field. And they lined up any woman who had been accused of, adultery during the previous, 10, 15 years. And they went right down the line, at the top of the goal box there, and boom, 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 publicly executed every single one of them, using fear to kind of instill that law and order immediately. So a lot of people maybe didn't like the Taliban, and maybe a lot of people viewed them as very brutal and maybe very extreme. But again, if you've been living through a war zone for 20 years, and existence has been a constant struggle for 20 years, and it's been complete and total anarchy around you for 20 years, there's a good chance that you're going to have a viewpoint that, like, hey, I don't care who rules me as long as somebody is promoting stability and peace. And so they did get a lot of buy-in from that perspective. Now, from here, and this is then kind of connecting the dots, and this last bullet is the really, really important one. So the Taliban pretty much takes the bulk of the country. They never take 100% of it all, but they take the bulk of the country then by 1996. Well, 1996 is also the same year that Osama bin Laden gets kicked out of Sudan. So Sudan starts getting a lot of pressure applied to it by the United States government. We actually send a few missile strikes into Sudan after some of these early Al Qaeda attacks. And so the Sudanese government says to Osama, hey, you're more trouble than you're worth. Get the heck out of here. And he's evicted a second time. Well, Osama's then looking around and he's like, well, where can I go? I need safe haven. I need some level of protection. And it's the exact same time that the Taliban takes control of Afghanistan. So Osama gets on the phone and he calls him up and he says, hey, Taliban, you guys remember me? It's Osama. I was like the guy that helped you out in that Soviet-Afghan war. I need a place to stay. Will you grant me asylum? And the Taliban agrees. So Osama and his core Al Qaeda leadership then move en masse and operate out in the open in Afghanistan. Over the next few years, you see a number of major attacks, again, on U.S. forces, both in the country and outside of the country. Some notable ones: 1998, 2 American embassies in Eastern Africa were bombed. So remember, an embassy is considered American soil. So it's like, you're not really attacking the United States proper, but you're symbolically attacking the United States. We also talked about in that previous foreign policy case study the bombing of the USS Cole in 2000. So that naval vessel, 17 American naval personnel killed in that attack. And then, of course, 9/11 shortly thereafter, close to 3,000 people killed and missing on a single day. So again, all of that is able to happen because of this Taliban asylum and the fact that they were able to operate out in the open with our country really doing nothing about it. Well, of course, then we see after the war, our nation then gives the Taliban an ultimatum. Hand him over or else. We know he was responsible. Hand him over or else. And the Taliban refuses because of Pashtunwali, right? They say, sorry, we got this cultural code thing. We granted them asylum. We can't revoke it. We're sorry. And so we invade in October 2001. We take over the country very, very rapidly. We decimate, both the Taliban and Al Qaeda's kind of core leadership and fighting forces. But unfortunately, we don't get them all. And much of the leadership of both of those groups, because remember, they're not the same, they're separate entities, flee into the mountains along the Afghan-Pakistan border. And they flee into the mountains there, and they kind of disappear. And we move in and we occupy Afghanistan. We start to try to rebuild, and we start to try to set up a democratic government there. And at least at first, it looks like everything is kind of hunky-dory until about like 2005, somewhere around there, when all of a sudden we start to see a huge uptick in Taliban activity in rural areas again. They pretty much do the same thing that they had done during the Soviet-Afghan War. They lie low, they blend in with the population, they recruit, they resupply, they use especially opium in order to kind of pay the bills, and they carry out then this kind of guerrilla insurgency, a war of attrition. Hey, we're going to wear you down, we're not going anywhere, you're eventually going to leave, and then we're going to seize power. That's been pretty much the Taliban mindset ever since. Now, in terms of Al Qaeda, we still see some level of Al Qaeda operations in Afghanistan, but for the most part, Al Qaeda after the invasion has primarily then kind of spread abroad. And where we have seen them kind of set up shop and gain kind of traction again is generally in countries that lack, central government authority. Places that are kind of anarchy, no man's land, places where it's easy for groups to just kind of operate out in the open or blend in with the population or disappear, places that we don't have maybe a direct reach. So I put there just a few examples, like we talked about Yemen previously. Yemen, once you're outside the major cities of Yemen, nobody's monitoring you. There's no government forces. There's no police. There's no infrastructure. And what's even more important than that, and this is kind of like coming full circle, big picture, is that, even though Osama himself, was eventually tracked down and killed in 2011, and even though much of the core leadership of Al Qaeda has been wiped out, you can't just wipe out an idea or a set of ideas, right? Like an idea is the ultimate genie in the bottle. Like once that genie comes out of the bottle, how the hell are you going to get that thing back in there? And the answer is that you're not. So the ideas associated with Al Qaeda have kind of taken a life of their own. And it's really that then that has sparked the growth of other similar radical militant groups like ISIS. Now, in terms of Afghanistan, and I'll close here. So Afghanistan, to this day, we still have some troops there. It's now America's longest war. We've been there for 20 years. As we speak, there's only about 2,500 American soldiers left. But the plan is to have those troops out by 9/11 of 2021. Whether or not that will happen is anybody's guess. I'm assuming that it will because of political reasons. But the other question is going to be, okay, once they do leave, then what? Then what? Is the Taliban going to peacefully enter the political process and take part in a democracy and run as a political party? Is the Taliban going to keep up this war against this, democratic government that we have attempted to create? Are they going to retake the country like overnight? Again, it's hard to read those tea leaves. Your guess is as good as mine. It's a very fragile country. It's always been a very fragile country. And it's amazing the fact that, the cost, both in terms of men and materials spent to kind of get in the situation that we are right now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Tomorrow, we're going to kind of build off of Afghanistan by looking at Iraq and Syria. And Iraq and Syria will help us then understand our kind of last topic in this mini focus on terrorism, specifically the rise of ISIS, where ISIS comes from amidst all of this. And I think that when we kind of get to that point later on in the week, all of these dots should connect together really nicely.